Good morning, Cascadia Church and family. We're back again looking at the book of Nehemiah. And today we're going to be looking at this topic or this idea of how to handle your critics. You have probably discovered, as I have, that anytime we make a commitment to live by the teachings of Jesus Christ, there's going to be some opposition or some criticism. We can expect that from people in the world. But sadly, there are times when people, even in God's own family, are judgmental or critical, or they're displeased with what we're doing for one reason or another. You've been misunderstood, you've been mistreated, so have I. And if you've been involved in leadership at any level for any length of time, you've been criticized. It just happens. It comes with the territory. One of my favorite writers, Warren Wiersbe, said this in a book that he wrote about the book of Nehemiah. He said, if you start building, pretty soon you will be battling. So be prepared. And let me read for you the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 4 here, to kind of set the scene, the backdrop for what we're looking at. And then we're going to take a look at how Nehemiah handled his critics and what we can do to best handle ours as well. So Nehemiah 4, 1 through 3 reads this way. Now it came about that when Sambala heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry, and he mocked the Jews. And he spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy people of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore the temple for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones from the heaps of rubble, even the burned ones? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, even what they are building, if a fox were to jump on it, it would break down their stone wall. So, yeah, these guys are doing God's will. And there's people on the outside looking in, criticizing and condemning what they're doing, because they didn't want the people of God to be successful in anything that they were setting out to accomplish. So let's take a look at how Nehemiah handled his critics. The first idea is this: turn your critics over to God. Turn your critics over to God. Verse 4, Nehemiah 4 reads this way: hear, O our God, how we are an object of contempt. So the people of God, those living in Jerusalem, being led by Nehemiah, were being made fun of. They were being ridiculed. They were being mocked simply because they wanted to honor God, simply because they wanted to do the right thing. And when they were criticized, when they were mistreated, when they were misrepresented, people were lying about them, they didn't fight back. The Jews in Jerusalem and Nehemiah, they did not fight back. Because the critics were looking for a fight. And you don't want to play into their hand, those that are criticizing you. You don't have to accept every invitation to a fight. So take a look at this. The book of Proverbs says, don't make a fool of yourself by answering a fool. If you're drawn into a debate, and you engage in that kind of a verbal conflict, for example, you are equally as foolish as the person that was taunting you. So instead of replying back to the person that is criticizing you, talk to God instead. That's what Nehemiah was doing. He said, as we continue to look at verse 4, return their taunting on their own heads and turn them into plunder in a land of captivity. Here's what Nehemiah is saying. In essence, God, these people that are criticizing us have no idea how much pain we have endured. They have no idea how good you have been to us in bringing us back into the land and giving us the opportunity to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. He goes on to say, by inference here, that we were sent into captivity, God, because we disobeyed you. But now it's our critics who are disobeying you. And so it's their turn to be punished. That's why he says, turn them into plunder in a land of captivity. Send them away, God. They're the ones that are disobedient to you now. Think about this. This is not a prayer, or this is not an act of vengeance. This is really about vindication. Vengeance is when we, on our own understanding, on our own terms, in our own power, try to make right the wrongs that were done to us. Vindication, on the other hand, this is what Nehemiah is looking for. Vindication is when we let God fight our battles. Vindication is when God clears the false accusations brought against us. Vindication validates our integrity and shows that all along we've been right with God. We've been doing the right thing for God. So when you're criticized, let God vindicate you. You don't have to fight back. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to prove that you're right. I'll tell you what, let God demonstrate to your critics that you have been right the whole time. Let him do it in his own time. Let him do it in his own way. We see that example many times in the scriptures, and that should be illustrated in our lives also. Sometimes you wait a very long time for the vindication to come, but God has promised it will come. So listen carefully, your best response to criticism is to remain faithful. Continue doing what God has called you to do. Stay focused and be successful. Continue being the person that God has created you to be, and continue doing the things that God has called you to do. See verse 5? Do not forgive their guilt, and do not let their sin be wiped out before you, for they have demoralized the builders. Nehemiah is calling for consequences. There's nothing wrong with that. There's always a consequence to sin. And Nehemiah is appealing to God, saying, God, I'm not going to do anything about this. I want you to do it, and I want you to do it in full measure. Give them what they deserve, Lord. So turn your critics over to God. Don't let them live in your head or in your heart. Evict those people. They don't belong there. They don't belong inside. Just let them go. Let God deal with them. He is more creative than you. He is more powerful than you. He is more effective than you. And I can tell you from experience, there's something deeply satisfying about watching God mess with those who have been messing with you. So let God do that work. Second idea, number 2, don't lose sight of the vision. Don't lose sight of the vision. Verse 6, so he built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. So your critics want you to lose focus. They want to turn your mind and your heart away from what God has called you to be, or who God has called you to be, and what God has called you to do. Don't let that happen. Don't empower your critics to be successful in that way. Nehemiah knew that if he listened to his critics, that he would lose sight of the vision, because that's what his critics wanted. And so if we lose sight of the vision, what we really capture in our sights and what we really become focused on is vindication, vengeance, and all those kinds of things, which is just very ungodly. Now, this threat that the people in Jerusalem were facing was very real from the outsiders who wanted to destroy them. This is why Nehemiah was praying about this. And this is why he kept his mind on the ministry. It was his mission. It was his vision. It's what God wanted him to do. We know from further revelation in Scripture that the way that the devil tries to distract us is he wants to affect the way that we think. He wants to change the way that we think. And so the way that he will infect us is by listening. If we listen to our critics, we're going to get infected. And so the devil wants to infect the way you think about God. He wants to infect the way you think about authority. He wants to infect the way you think about accountability and about autonomy. And a rejection of accountability, independence, and all those kind of things leads to rebellion, spiritual rebellion, which is disastrous. So we want to stay away from that for sure. You see in this verse here that the people had a mind to work. Their mind was focused. They were not distracted. And so they stayed focused on the vision, and they continued to build the wall. All right, final point. Here we go. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this one. This is an important dimension here. Number 3, guard against future opposition. Now, when Sambala, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. So the more successful the people in Jerusalem were, the more angry were Sanballat and Tobiah and the others who lived around the city of Jerusalem. So last week, we saw that there was support for the builders that came from outside the city. Today, we're seeing that there is opposition for the workers from outside the city. So not only support, but opposition came from the outside there as well. Here's a little map for you to show where this opposition was. Sanballat and Tobiah recruited their neighbors to come in opposition against Jerusalem. And so the holy city is surrounded by those who are opposing them. It's not the first time that's happened, and it's not the last time it's going to happen. And so in verse 8, we read about their goal, which was conflict. This is why the city was surrounded and threatening and intimidating the people in Jerusalem. So all of them, these nations around Jerusalem, conspired together to come to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So as I said just a moment ago, the goal was conflict. That's what critics do. Their goal is a fight. They want to be engaged in conflict. It's ridiculous. And they often create conflict through confusion. See this? Look at this. All of them conspired together. And the goal was confusion. So Nehemiah's response to this threat was twofold. First of all, he prayed. Look at verse 9. But we prayed to our God, and because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. So here's a twofold strategic response to the threat against Jerusalem. They prayed to their God, and they set up a guard. We prayed to our God, we set up a guard. So they asked God to protect the people. And the way that God answered that prayer was the people themselves protected the people. Often when we ask God for things or to do things, he wants us to be the ones that are actually doing it. And so Nehemiah remained focused on the priorities, and he created a plan to make sure that the people in Jerusalem were safe. Now, in the near future in this series, we're going to look at some specific ways in which Nehemiah guarded the city of Jerusalem. But now we're going to look at the way that this conspiracy evolved. How did these people conspire together? What was their strategy in coming against Jerusalem? And this is why it was so important for those in Jerusalem to set up a guard, not only within, but around the city as well. In verse 7, we read about Sanballat and Tobiah. We saw that just recently, just a couple of moments ago. Sanballat and Tobiah. What we find out, first of all, here in keeping the city safe is that Nehemiah is naming the enemies. He's naming them by name. That also is a biblical precedent. It's a biblical pattern from cover to cover. The enemies of God's people are named by names. And these two men, we've met them before. They're troublemakers. Sambala and Tobiah. If we go back all the way to chapter 2, that's when we first were introduced to these men. Notice this. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, that the wall was going to be built, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. So there's something going on in the hearts of these people. They were opposed to the will of God. They were opposed to the work of God, and they became very upset. They were very displeased and angry about what was happening. A few verses later, we read this. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official, and now here's a new guy. Here's a third guy. They recruited this guy. Geshem the Arab heard about it. They mocked us and despised us. So they're starting the intimidation behaviors here right away once they gather more people to oppose those in the holy city. Now, recently we were introduced to a man named Eliashib. Eliashib was the high priest in the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah Chapter 3 verse 1 reads this way, you might remember it. Eliashib the high priest arose with his brothers, the priests, and built the sheep gate. We also read that a little bit later on as we go on that he worked with other people, as you can see in this verse. They were very diligent, they were very faithful, they were very productive. They saw the need, they saw that they could help, they engaged, they were fruitful, they were helpful, they were on board, they were on task. They did very well. But we want to look a little bit closer at what happened, because the heart of this man was turned against Nehemiah. He ended up betraying Nehemiah. Even though he started out well, he didn't finish well. So now there's a few people here that we want to talk about. Sambala, Eliashib, and Tobiah. In a few weeks, we're going to be in the final chapter, chapter 13 of Nehemiah. When we get there, we're going to read this. Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was a relative of Tobiah. Now, pause for a moment and note this. Eliashib is the high priest. Tobiah is the archenemy of Nehemiah. And these men are family. They're related. The relationship is poisoned. Eliashib's relationship with Nehemiah is poisoned because of family ties. There's a biblical principle about things that are clean and unclean. If something clean, which we're going to say is Eliashib, comes in contact with something unclean, let's say it's Tobiah, and they touch, or there's some sort of a relationship or connection there. The scriptures say that the clean does not make the unclean clean. The unclean makes the clean unclean. That's what happened here with Eliashib and Tobiah. Tobiah infected Eliashib's thinking about Nehemiah, because these men are in a relationship they should not have been in. They're family. They're related to one another. And Eliashib knew better. He should have had nothing to do with Tobiah and his family. But Eliashib compromised, and there's a significant collapse that comes as a result. Let's take a look at, here's another thing, a little bit later on in chapter 13. Nehemiah has been away for a year in Persia, giving a report to the king about the status of the rebuilding project. And he says, when I came, for Nehemiah 13:7, I came to Jerusalem, he came back from Persia, and I learned about, notice this, the evil that Eliashib had committed for Tobiah. The high priest sinned for his family member. And the sin that he committed was allowing Tobiah to take up residency in the temple courts. That was not only biblically wrong, not only was it a biblical sin, it was also a significant breach of security. Why do you have an enemy living inside the gate, inside the walls, inside the temple courts? Why are you doing this? It's no wonder that Nehemiah said it was an evil thing that Eliashib did. Now, regarding Sanballat, Nehemiah 13, same chapter, says this. Joiada was the son of Eliashib, the high priest. One of Joiada's sons married the daughter of Sanballat from the town of Beit Horon, so I made Joiada leave Jerusalem. Here we go. Sanballat is one of the enemies of Nehemiah, one of the enemies of Jerusalem, and he is related by marriage to Eliashib, the high priest. So Eliashib, there's another significant compromise in his life based on family relations through marriage. And this whole network of people is becoming enmeshed and convoluted and twisted and unfaithful in a significant spiritual threat and security threat to the people living inside the city of Jerusalem. What we know about what happened is that these alignments and even Tobiah moving into the courtyards of the temple, listen carefully, all this occurred when Nehemiah was away in Persia. Eliashib waited until the leader was gone before he began to conspire with other people and compromise spiritually, morally, in security measures, and all sorts of other things. And what happened was that Eliashib's loyalty to God, first of all, was compromised. And then his loyalty to Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem was compromised as well. This man betrayed Nehemiah. And the backdrop and the prep work for that betrayal occurred while Nehemiah was away. I talked with a ministry consultant just not too long ago about conflict in the church and how and why and when pastors are removed from the ministry. Often removals come as a result of betrayal. Those who, and this is not just my story, this is a story of many, many pastors. There's been a lot of writing and research done on this. The pattern is so prevalent, so repeated so often that there's been writing about it and research done, and it's a consistent pattern that often there's going to be criticism toward the leader. And those who once were faithful and loyal and once used to be engaged in the work of the ministry begin to criticize the leader. It is usually done through families, whether they are blood families or they're related by marriage. This happens in the church today. It happens often. And I was talking with this church consultant about my own story. And he asked me, he said, how long was it after you got back from a vacation that this all came down? And I said, 6 weeks. Why do you even ask that question? That's the first question he asked me. He said, because that's the pattern. That's usually what happens. A pastor takes a vacation or a sabbatical, and he comes back and he says, usually within 6 weeks, they're out of the ministry because they've been forced out by others. It's kind of the idea that when the cat's away, the mice will play. And so when we get into chapter 13, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, how good and how strong a leader Nehemiah was, but he wasn't a perfect leader. He made a fatal leadership error here when he went to Persia. He did not put someone in his position to cover for him, someone that he could trust. Somebody had the authority to act on his behalf when he was away. And I think that had he put somebody in his place while he was away for that year, he would have squashed this conspiracy, these people coming together to criticize and remove. That was their goal, was to remove Nehemiah from leadership. Anyway, enough about that. We need to move on. The problem is real, and the problem persists. It remains. So this is going to lead us to our takeaway for today, which is this. I will turn over my critics to God. I will turn over my critics to God. Just because, as I said before, just because somebody starts off strong doesn't mean they're going to finish well. It doesn't mean that they're going to remain loyal if they started loyal. It doesn't mean that they're going to remain faithful if they started out faithful. Things change. Things happen. Thoughts begin to change. Attitudes begin to sour and so forth. And so loyalties can turn on a dime. And we need to be careful about that. So here's the thing. When you start hearing criticism, and I'm going to talk to leaders at this point, when you're on a leadership team, and anybody on your leadership team begins to criticize you privately or publicly, regardless of what your role is on the team, regardless of what the other person's role is on the team, it doesn't matter. The first time there's any kind of criticism, that thing has to be dealt with immediately and swiftly and permanently. That was the leadership mistake of my life, not dealing with criticism, passive aggressive, sarcastic, crude, rude, vulgar sometimes comments. I figured, let's get beyond this. Let's just move ahead. We should have put a full stop on it and dealt with it immediately. Major mistake on my part. And I guess I'm kind of in good company. But Nehemiah had the authority to act decisively, and he did. We'll get into that in chapter 13. So the point is, don't give anybody any room for any kind of criticism, sarcasm, ridicule, mockery, sometimes vulgar language, often false accusations, half-truths, whatever it might be. Zero tolerance for that. Zero. It's going to come back and it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you a lot if you don't deal with it immediately. And if you don't know how to deal with it, get some help. Call a friend, call a colleague, get a consultant, and make sure they actually show up and deal with it. It's super, super important. So learn from me and from the greatest leadership mistake of my life. You don't want to go there. It's too painful. It's too difficult. All right. Instead, turn your critics over to God. But that doesn't mean that you become passive. You need to take action and allow God to guide you in the decisions that you're making, the direction that you're going, the counsel and the support that you're receiving. It's going to save your leadership, and it can save your ministry. It can save your marriage. It can save your family. It can save your career, whatever it might be. So there's just a couple of tips there from Nehemiah on how to handle your critics. I hope it was helpful. We'll see you next week.